Let's continue with Buchanan's idea of constitutional political economy. In Part 2, we will discuss the conceptual model he uses to explain important ideas in constitutional political economy. Important conceptual assumptions can be found in two quotes from his book, The Limits of Liberty. First, the approach must be democratic. Each person counts for one. A criterion for betterness is suggested. A situation is judged good to the extent that it allows individuals to get what they want to get, whatsoever this might be, limited only by the principle of mutual agreement. The second quote is, "What are good and bad results here?" The answer is simple, but it is extremely important. That is good which tends to emerge from the free choices of the individuals who are involved. It is impossible for an external observer to lay down criteria for goodness independent of the process through which results or outcomes are attained. The evaluation is applied to the means of attaining outcomes, not the outcomes as such. Okay. Let's make his conceptual presumptions explicit. Each person counts for one. This is typical for a conceptual microeconomic analysis. Unanimity, or perhaps mutual agreement, is emphasized in the conceptual analysis. This too is used in conceptual microeconomics. For example, mutual agreement fits with the idea of a market equilibrium. What we presume is good is that which emerges from the free choices of the individuals. We should probably contrast this conceptual presumption with the conceptual presumptions of standard normative economics. Standard normative economics essentially presumes good means an efficient allocation. Buchanan presumes it is impossible for an external observer, such as we economists, to have criteria for judging goodness that are independent of the process. In some respects, this means he presumes we should work with real circumstances. And he presumes we economists will be able to evaluate means, not outcomes. After all, Buchanan says we should presume we cannot know the purposes of each of the people involved in market processes and/or in political processes. Buchanan's conceptual analysis begins with Robinson Crusoe and Friday. Imagine Crusoe washed up on a desert island, all alone. Because Crusoe is alone, there is no need for government. There is also no need for the market process. Crusoe learns to make a living for himself alone. As a sort of footnote, note that Crusoe alone is really like our allocation models. The model of a consumer is about an individual making trade-offs given a budget and prices. No one else is involved in the model. Crusoe alone on the island really is like this, with the island environment essentially determining prices. And even a market allocation model is like this. Why? Because all the buyers and sellers are assumed to be price takers. Each individual reacts to prices and to price changes. We do not have one social interaction explicitly in the market allocation model. Of course, Buchanan encourages us to emphasize exchange. To be able to consider pairwise social interactions, we are going to have to add at least Friday to the analysis. So let's imagine now that Crusoe is out walking around the island one day, and he notices smoke on the horizon. Wow! He thought he was alone. So Crusoe cautiously approaches a campfire, hiding behind rocks and trees, and he discovers there is another person on the island. This other person looks to be pretty successful. He seems to have several interesting items Crusoe doesn't. Crusoe faces a choice. He can decide to walk right up to this other person, stick out his hand, and say, "Hi, I'm Crusoe. What's your name? Let's trade." Or Crusoe might decide to sneak away thinking, "I'm going to come back after dark with my big bat. Take what I want." If Crusoe and Friday begin to trade with one another, the pairwise, voluntary social interactions between them will mean both are better off. Over time, a division of labor between them will probably emerge. They will each specialize in different productive activities. The trades between Crusoe and Friday are studied most often in microeconomics with allocation models. Buchanan encourages us to emphasize the pairwise, voluntary social interactions instead. But this kind of study is not what Buchanan does with limits of liberty. Buchanan writes, Crusoe, if he chooses to avoid pure conflict, and if he realizes that Friday's interests are likely to be different from his own, will recognize that mutual gains can be secured through cooperative endeavor, that is, through exchange or trade. This mutuality of advantage that may be secured as a result of cooperative arrangements, be these simple or complex, is the one important truth of our discipline. Of course, if Crusoe and Friday trade, we can say this interaction reflects the unanimity of market process. The realm of pairwise voluntary social interaction is like Crusoe and Friday trading over and over and over. But so far, there is no government, and no need for government if Crusoe chooses to walk into Friday's camp saying, "Let's trade." Buchanan's model in Limits of Liberty explores Crusoe's choice to instead go back to his camp and get his bat, to explore the idea that Crusoe decides not to avoid pure conflict. In Buchanan's conceptual view, government emerges from conflict. Imagine now that Crusoe acts to use force and coercion to get what he wants from Friday. When Crusoe shows up with his bat, Friday now faces choices. Friday had also thought he was alone on the island. Now he discovers this is not true because another man is poised to attack him with a big bat. Friday can give in. He can attempt to defend himself. And perhaps after this specific event, he can even counterattack and try to take from Crusoe. I suppose this may seem unrealistic given our experiences. Maybe it is just a useful conceptual exercise. And I do think it is a useful conceptual analysis. But I also think that a quick look at any world history textbook suggests it has not been unusual in the world of human action for social interactions to involve force instead of cooperation. Now, imagine that after some time passes and both Crusoe and Friday experience predation and defense in their lives, that they may reach an equilibrium. This equilibrium idea with respect to predation and defense Buchanan calls the natural distribution. It is a situation characterized by social interactions of predation and defense that yield no additional benefits to either Crusoe or Friday. From this natural distribution, Crusoe and Friday may each come to see a value in trading. Friday might say, "Hey, Crusoe, this continual conflict is stupid. If we agree to stop, we won't waste our time fighting and we can spend more time producing. We can essentially trade right now by giving up predation and defense activities. If we do, we can both be better off." If Crusoe sees the wisdom in Friday's proposal, he might say, "Okay, Friday, let's make a deal." And then, do they both live happily ever after? Not so fast. Buchanan writes, economic exchange among persons is facilitated by mutual agreement on defined rights. These rights must be recognized and accepted by participants. So, the predation defense activities of Crusoe and Friday are conceptually conflict over rights. When they agree to stop fighting, and even to exchange away from the natural distribution of predation defense, we really have mutual agreement on property rights. Still, at this point, we don't yet recognize a reason for government. They both are tired of fighting. They both agree, you have what you have, and I have what I have. Now, let's trade. Consider that Buchanan says, conflict emerges, or may emerge, not from any specific assignment of individual rights, but from disagreement over and uncertainty about just what the legally enforceable assignment is. Crusoe and Friday fighting was essentially trying to discover what each could enforce against the other. If they reach a natural distribution, they have figured this out for themselves. At this point, Buchanan's conceptual analysis suggests that they will essentially agree to a contract. Buchanan notices this is essentially a constitutional stage of their social interactions. They contract. The contract they agree to at this stage is really a constitution. And now, a very important conceptual distinction can be seen. After their constitutional agreement, essentially about property rights, they trade with each other. Their trades occur at a post-constitutional stage of social interactions. Still, we don't see a reason for government. At some time in the future, either Crusoe or Friday might decide to break the agreement and return to forceful action against the other. Of course, each can see this, or if they can't at first, over time they can, because one of them will try to gain by returning to conflict. So now, they each see an incentive to have a third person, Samantha, who will enforce their contract. Samantha would be government. And Buchanan calls this purpose for government the protective state. Could there be any other reason for government? If there were only private goods, the answer would be no. Voluntary, pairwise social interactions would be sufficient for people to pursue their own personal projects. But what if there are also shared consumption goods? In this case, individuals would recognize the need to interact within groups in order to consume such goods. Does a problem emerge with shared consumption goods? Well, if there is only Crusoe and Friday, it seems likely they will be able to agree on the quantity of the shared good as well as the cost each will have to pay for their part of gaining the shared good. But as the number of those who would share the good increases, it becomes more and more likely that mutual agreements on quantity and on cost share will not be possible. An interesting aspect of this is that even with many people, there will be people, maybe many, who can see that shared consumption may benefit by having government provision. Each can potentially see, or perhaps be persuaded by others to realize, that to solve the problem of deciding how much to share and who pays what may require government as the means. If such a government purpose can be agreed to, Buchanan calls this purpose for government the productive state. Of course, given the conceptual presumptions, in this analysis, the productive state must be agreed to at the constitutional stage. And at the constitutional stage, agreement would have to be unanimous. That is, there would have to be mutual agreement because if someone did not agree, they would walk away and at a minimum return to forceful defense activities for themselves. But it is clear also that given the nature of social interactions with shared consumption goods, the people agreeing to the productive state at the constitutional stage may well agree that the actual choices with respect to shared consumption will be allowed to be made without unanimity. That is, constitutional choices happen with unanimity, and one of those choices might be that in the post-constitutional stage, the productive state may decide without unanimity. Unanimity might or might not be chosen for the productive state's actions in the post-constitutional social interactions, but because the constitutional stage would be agreed to with unanimity, there is still a conceptual way to understand government on the basis of mutual agreement and even on the basis of unanimity. What are some important ideas about the protective state? Buchanan writes, at the constitutional stage, the state emerges as the enforcing agency, conceptually external to the contracting parties and charged with the single responsibility of enforcing agreed-on rights and claims along with contracts which involve voluntarily negotiated exchanges of such claims. This protective state, the institutions of law broadly interpreted, is not a decision-making body. It has no legislating function, and it is not properly represented by legislative institutions. It is not democratic in the sense that collective decisions are reached through some voting process. Wow, this is a very significant implication of the conceptual analysis. The legislative body is not relevant on Buchanan's view of constitutional political economy to the purposes of government as the protective state. In the constitutional stage, the agreements related to a legislature would be the agreements about the purpose of government as the productive state. One of the important ideas about the productive state is that the rules for determining the quantity of the shared good and the individual cost shares will be agreed to at the constitutional stage. One implication of this would seem to be that it would not be appropriate for the legislature itself to be allowed to change these sorts of rules about decision-making. So, the legislative function of government is about shared consumption goods. It is not about deciding on property rights. It is not about deciding on enforcement of property rights. Agreements about such issues do not follow in the post-constitutional stage by means of legislative decision-making. Unanimity may or may not be relevant to legislative decision-making. Unanimity may or may not be relevant to the productive state and the provision of shared consumption goods. Nonetheless, unanimity is required at the constitutional stage regarding the nature of legislative decision-making with respect to provision of shared consumption goods. So, conceptually, even for decisions made at the post-constitutional stage, there is still the unanimity and mutual agreement, which is an element of government and the productive state.